Okay, we'll call this public caucus to order. Tonight we have Business Administrator Larry West and Adrian Vicari from Hubert, Rowland, and Griebus to give us an update on a regional stormwater initiative. So the floor is yours.
Good evening, Council. Thank you for the invitation. That's why we just call it HRG. Councilman Donahue, it's just easier. But appreciate Adrian coming up from Harrisburg today. You may recall we've engaged HRG now several times to do some stormwater consulting here in the city. They've always done a great job for us, so we appreciate the work they continue to do. We've just awarded a contract for the East Mountain stormwater analysis as well. So tonight I think Adrian can walk through. As you know, we engaged in another contract extension with HRG, I think it was earlier this year, to help us navigate a stormwater authority, at least to talk about, what's some of the best ways that we can address some of the stormwater needs through an authority. Last year, over the course of the last 2 years, HRG has worked with the city to come up with a proposal for a countywide analysis, and then we re-engage them, and they've come back with what a multiple joint municipal authority might look like. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Adrian to walk through the slideshow. Hope everyone can see it up on our new wall. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry, and good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to provide an update for you on the Regional Stormwater Authority feasibility analysis and the implementation plan. So again, as Larry mentioned, last fall, when I had the opportunity to meet with you, we discussed recommendations of the study. And at that time, it was for a countywide stormwater authority that would initially be able to benefit 22 regulated municipalities within the county who have MS4 permit compliance requirements and are dealing with those associated costs. Based upon city discussions with the county last fall and into the winter, it became apparent that the county may be willing to support that type of initiative, but if so, it was going to be a longer lead time. This is kind of a long-term event they might look into, but that didn't necessarily match up with the municipality's needs, and they'd be looking for a solution that might be able to be implemented within the next year or two. So based upon that, we went back to the drawing board with a smaller subset of municipalities to look at what a smaller regional authority for stormwater management could look like. So I wanted to use our time together today to update you on what that vision could look like and what we see the associated benefits being. So just to kind of remind us of some of the background and why we got to the point that we're at in looking at this, there's been a number of stormwater issues and challenges that have been building in the Lackawanna region. And many of you will remember these from our previous discussions, but that first challenge is polluted streams and waterways. So there's a number of streams in the valley that are considered impaired. They're not meeting their designated uses, and in many cases that's due to sediment pollution or acid mine drainage throughout the valley. Another challenge that Scranton's seeing and the other municipalities are seeing are these tightening DEP and EPA regulation. So now municipalities need to do more to meet those requirements, especially municipalities like Scranton that have MS4 permits. So MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems. So these are portions of your stormwater system that aren't tied in to the wastewater system. They're just portions of the system that only control stormwater flow. You have an MS4 permit associated with that. And so now you and 21 other municipalities in the county need to, for the first time, start implementing what are green infrastructure projects. They're known as BMPs, or best management practices, and they're designed to reduce sediment pollution getting into local waterways. And they benefit the region, they're needed for permit compliance, but the challenge is that they're considered an unfunded mandate. And so, Scranton's struggling with the additional costs that takes, but so are a lot of the surrounding municipalities. And there's several municipalities in the county that have failed to meet their permit milestones with DEP. And we're finding that DEP is starting to follow up with these municipalities. In addition to those tightening regulations, we're also finding that there's aging stormwater infrastructure. Those costs are increasing. In many cases, we're finding municipalities don't necessarily have the tax revenue to keep up with the maintenance that's really needed on the systems. Another thing that we're seeing, especially with the last few days of rainfall, is we're seeing increased development, higher intensity storms that leads to more stormwater runoff, and that's causing more flooding and property damage, both in Scranton and in surrounding areas. And then all of that boils down to this other challenges relative to funding through municipal tax revenue. So we see, all these other challenges whose costs are growing, and tax revenue in many of the municipalities is relatively stagnant. So how do you continue to keep doing more with less and less money and keep that dollar stretching further and further? So we mentioned some of those higher intensity storms. So Scranton has seen the impacts of increased rainfall and flooding, and the pictures on this slide, I believe, are from events over the last year or so. And in addition to Scranton, the surrounding municipalities are also seeing the impacts of flooding events. You can see here some pictures from the Abington area, from Dixon City. So there's this growing need to devote funding towards flood reduction, to aid in public safety, reduce the likelihood of property value loss due to flooding, but at the same time, much of the valley's stormwater infrastructure needs to be replaced and more money needs to be put on regulation. And this slide goes into a little more detail about the regulation. It talks about where we're at now and then where the regulation is anticipated to go in future years. So now we're in the middle of the 2018 permit cycle for many municipalities. So MS4 regulated municipalities in Lackawanna County, there's 22 of them, I believe. They need to implement those best management practices, the green infrastructure projects to reduce sediment. Last week, DEP came and they announced that they're going to be extending the current permit term for the general permits. So that's giving municipalities 2 more years in their current permit cycle, but DEP did not extend the timetable to complete those green infrastructure projects. So while they said, okay, we're giving you 2 more years in this permit term, the deadline to complete projects hasn't lengthened at all. So there's this increased need to get those done. In addition to what these MS4 permits are requiring urbanized municipalities to do, there's also increased focus that's going on for rural municipalities as well. So currently, ag properties are required to have conservation and nutrient management plans, and those are to reduce nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment in some areas. But also the county completed a countywide action plan over this past year, and that looked at how to further reduce nitrogen and phosphorus runoff from those more rural properties. So where we're going in the future, and this is, we're saying 2025 plus, we're anticipated to see additional municipalities in the county fall under MS4 regulation. So instead of it being 21, 22 municipalities, that number is probably going to grow. And they're going to have to do more requirements like Scranton does. We're also anticipating the need for additional best management practices, those green infrastructure projects to be installed. And DEP is saying that they anticipate seeing an alignment of your MS4 permit and those permits that regulate urbanized municipalities with this countywide action plan that's focused on rural municipalities. And so what that means is there could be a likelihood to not only need to reduce for sediment pollution, but also reduce for nitrogen and phosphorus as well. And if you take the county goals that were given by Pennsylvania to Lackawanna County, and if those goals were to be spread across the municipalities, the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that the city would need to reduce by, you wouldn't be able to do that on your own. You just don't have the type of space, the type of land to actually be able to reduce for nitrogen and phosphorus within your borders. So that means you'd have to work with surrounding municipalities to become compliant.
So with that being said, you mean like we don't have a high enough baseline number to reduce it?
No, I mean, you don't have enough available green space to do the types of projects that you'd actually be able to see the nitrogen and phosphorus reduction. So while they have a formula where they allocate those loadings per municipality based upon land use type, you don't actually have the land available within the city borders to put green infrastructure projects where you could get the credit and the load reduction that they'd be looking for you to do.
So you're talking about the agricultural piece that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah,
So who has the right on that? So of course we understand our issues with the city and surrounding areas, but the agricultural piece, who's that follow? Is it the county?
who's
Or
that what?
municipalities? Who's going to be responsible for making sure that they meet their requirements? Because is that county or is it by the rural municipalities?
So right now it's at the county level. So counties throughout the Chesapeake Bay were giving funding from DEP to complete what's called a countywide action plan. And so through that countywide action plan, Pennsylvania said, okay, Lackawanna County, this is the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that's coming from the county. So how would you reduce that? Where would you put those BMPs and those projects to try to stop nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that's getting in the waterways? So, but then it comes down to if that goes into the county's MS4 permit, how would they implement that? And we could find that it actually goes into the municipality's MS4 permits, because DEP has said that over time they anticipate seeing that MS4 permits and this countywide action plan align. If they actually want to see these projects getting implemented, in some way they have to tie it to existing permits in order to have that compliance piece. So they haven't quite figured out how they're going to do it, but all they're saying is, we see these permits aligning. And so what that means for the city is it would be really hard to be compliant just on your own. You'd have to find partners in other municipalities to complete those projects.
I have just two quick questions, just to clarify, because I know you brought up the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So do these regulations only apply to those that are within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, or are these statewide regulations?
They apply to, so the BMPs that you're required to do in the pollution reduction plan, so those are tied to goals for municipalities in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but there's other municipalities that are also located in watersheds with impairments other than the Chesapeake Bay impairments. And so those municipalities that also drain to impaired waterways, a lot of them have to do those similar requirements.
Okay. And then the second one is, in terms of the MS4 permitting, right now every municipality has their own MS4 permit, right? But whether it's a regional or county, then eventually a county initiative, that would combine into one MS4 permit, correct? Instead of each one having their own, or?
So it could combine into having a joint permit with all the municipalities. And if it were to be at the county level, then I could see it being like co-permittees, the municipalities being co-permittees with the county or with a county-based authority. Because DEP still wants the municipalities to have a little bit of skin in the game to make sure that at the municipal level, you're passing ordinances and policies to help enable proper stormwater management.
Okay.
So with what we just talked about with all of those growing challenges, with where regulation may be going, there's a number of benefits that could be realized by coming together to manage stormwater on a watershed or regional basis. And we talked a lot about these benefits previously when we were talking about the results of the feasibility study, but in general, I'd say one of the biggest benefits in coming together is going to be the cost savings. So for many of the regional programs that we've been able to help implement in Pennsylvania, we've seen costs cut in half for municipalities, and then those savings get passed on to the property owner. So you can see on the slide, if you look at that red font, cost savings between 45% and 95% are being witnessed in other programs that we've been able to develop and implement in other parts of the state. Another benefit is larger scale grant funding. So subsidized funding, in many cases, is getting harder to come by. We're seeing funding agencies give higher consideration to entities that have sustainable stormwater programs. We're also seeing with this federal infrastructure bill, there's money out there for stormwater, but it's being provided at the federal level. And if you look at how a lot of other states manage stormwater, it's done at the county level. So we're going to see bigger projects proposed and going after this funding that are supporting larger constituent bases. So in order for this area to compete for that federal infrastructure bill money for stormwater, really going to need to be proposing larger projects that benefit a larger area. We also see that regional solutions support watershed-based planning and management. So political boundaries and watershed boundaries, they seldom coincide. And so when you can move outside of the political boundaries of a single municipality and you can solve stormwater problems on a watershed basis, that's when you can start addressing the problem and the source of the problem together. So for instance, you can address a downstream flooding problem at the same time you're addressing the upstream cause of the flooding, where now many times those two things are in different municipalities, right? So if you're a downstream municipality, other times you struggle to really find an effective stormwater solution. You're more just band-aiding the problem, but we can move outside, we can stop dealing with it in a fragmented approach, then more holistic solutions can be implemented, especially when we talk about flooding concerns. We find, as I mentioned before, municipalities are forced to spend more money on BMPs to meet these new MS4 permit requirements. When you do it on a regional basis, you can move outside of the walls of a municipality and where you site those green infrastructure projects. So it actually provides the opportunity to put those projects in areas where there's flooding issues. So you're killing two birds with one stone, so you have to spend this money to meet this regulation. But if you can put it in a spot where you're also addressing another stormwater problem, then it's not just like you're spending money towards this unfunded mandate, right? But you're actually solving other problems that you're dealing with at the same time. And we have seen DEP streamline regulations for groups of municipalities that come together to manage stormwater. And because of that, the cost to comply with regulation really comes down. And then another benefit is economies of scale. So there's a lot of fixed cost involved with stormwater management, and when you can spread those fixed costs over multiple municipalities, then you're just automatically going to see a cost per municipality come down. So those are some of the key benefits that we're seeing with a regional initiative. And because of that, back in 2019 and 2020, we surveyed the regulated municipalities in Lackawanna County, and we said to them, what is your interest in working together to manage stormwater, and in what ways could you really use the most support? And so you see some of the general results up on the slide. So basically they said, hey, we're willing to give up municipal control over water quality and flood control projects if a regional cooperative is found to be more efficient and effective than doing it on our own. They also saw a need to increase funding, and they were interested in a new funding source that was dedicated to water resource improvements. And they were also interested in receiving money back from a regional program that they could use to maintain locally owned infrastructure.
So is this survey of the 22 local municipalities you mentioned earlier?
This survey is we sent surveys to those 22 regulated municipalities in the county and received responses from 17 of those 22. And so this is kind of the general results of that. More in-depth results are in the feasibility study we presented last year. But these are some of the main results. They also said they could use the most support with funding to improve existing infrastructure. In fact, you'll see with that orange circle there that all municipalities responded they could use the most support for funding to improve existing infrastructure that's deteriorating. They also mentioned looking for support with MS4 permit administration and designing and implementing those green infrastructure projects. And then instead of handling flooding issues on an individual municipal basis, they'd like a regional collaboration on watershed-based flood reduction.
Adrian,
Yes.
of the 5 that decided not to participate or aren't interested, what were the general reasons given for not choosing not to be involved?
I would say in general, they felt like they were doing an okay job on their own, managing stormwater, and that they preferred to have that individual control as opposed to working together. Do you remember anything more kind of specific you wanted to share?
One of the municipalities was the Mid-Valley community that had, over the last 20 years, had 2 or 3 of their tributaries that go into the Lackawanna, they had been rebuilt. So, most of the smaller communities have those tributaries that kind of cut through their towns that dump into the Lackawanna. They find, that's where a lot of the issues are. This particular municipality had their 3 or 4 streams already encased in concrete flood control systems, so they weren't necessarily interested in it. And the others were smaller, further upstream, permitted up toward the Carbondale area that, to Adrian's point, they just felt they were doing a good enough job. They didn't need to have any additional outside support. But by far and large, the 17 other communities, the typical, Carbondale, Archbold, a few others were definitely interested in working with a broader regional approach.
So just on that point, they might have had that opinion 2 years ago, right? But do they still hold that opinion now moving forward, or has their tone changed on that?
So I think there's still an interest. So we have, in my prior role working for the senator, was when we started this, having these discussions. I think there's still the interest. They're all aware. Adrian alluded to that the general permits are extended for 2 years. Most of the communities that we're talking about have a general permit. It's a general state permit. We here in Scranton and Music are the only 2 that have what's called the individual permit. We had DEP just reissued our permit, about a 5-year permit just recently, right? So there are only 2 communities that we're participating with that have an individual. The rest of them are general permits. So they're all still interested. I believe they're interested. We did have a meeting today. Not all the communities showed up, not with the county-wide, but just on the original 7 other communities, just to kind of bring them up to speed as to what was going on. I do believe, based on the report that HRG has provided, we need to take another look, and we really need to start moving as to what our next steps are here as a city. We need to move so that we're in compliance, and hopefully we could convince or at least get the word out to the surrounding communities that they ought to be having these conversations as well. So I think our next step is to really have a conversation about the next step and what HRG has found here, and and not only the presentation she has here tonight, but also in the one that was presented last year, which was the countywide. So we need to have a discussion about what our next steps are here.
And just in terms of the difference between, what you classified as an individual permit from a general permit, is the individual permit, are the requirements more strict? Or is it the other way around? How would you, briefly, I guess, just describe what the
Sure.
difference is between a general and an individual?
So if you have a general permit, then basically all municipalities with general permits throughout the state, their permit looks exactly the same. So they just have the state's general permit. If you have an individual.
Regardless of, what sort of tributaries they have running through there, is that what you mean? Okay.
It's the same requirements in that general permit. When you have an individual permit, then you could have other requirements. You could also have a different timetable, and that's what we find with the city of Scranton. So your timetable as part of this permit cycle is a little different than the municipalities that their own general permit, but I think that provides some advantages, and it also gives the city some time and flexibility. Not a lot of time and flexibility, but it gives you the opportunity to spend, the next year working with municipalities to look at what this regional solution could really look like.
As Adrian talked about earlier, for now, the city in this current permit cycle in regards to DEP, we're going to be okay in terms of some of the things that we have to do to make sure we're compliant with this permit. It's the permits that come after, and our ability to meet those compliance regulations is where we find ourselves. So if we're not putting ourselves out there now to make sure that we are setting up the government infrastructure, if you will, to take care of the physical infrastructure, then I think we'll be behind the 8 ball. So the timing is, one, our permit is good, the general permits are not. They have the 2-year extension on the permit, but they're not for the things that they have to fix. But that 2-year cycle gives us, to Adrian's point, about a year for us to get our ducks in a row to make sure that our next steps, that we're going to be in a good place as we move forward as a city.
And so, where we've gotten today, we've gone through several rounds of planning. So this really started with the city back in 2017, 2018, when the city engaged Caucus, which is another consulting firm, to look at what a stormwater authority just serving inside the city boundaries might look like. And I think after going through that process, the city arrived at the point of thought that, this doesn't really seem like it's the best solution for us. So that's why we then dove into the feasibility study to look at a regional collaboration. And as I mentioned, from there, we looked at how the county-based stormwater authority could really make sense in helping to meet current needs, but also some of the future needs countywide as well. And then, as I mentioned before, last fall, there started to be more of a misalignment between the county's potential implementation timeline for this type of collaboration and the needs of the municipalities. So this led to a revisioning of the authority approach over the last year. And so that's what I wanted to update you on tonight. So we're currently proposing an 8-member regional startup stormwater authority. We're initially terming it the Lackawanna Joint Municipal Stormwater Authority, and it would include the city of Scranton and then several surrounding municipalities, which also fall under MS4 regulation and share in the overall goals and needs for a regional initiative. So you can see what we're showing up on the slide. This is what we're looking at in terms of initial partners for this collaboration.
And I just want to be clear, we have met with representatives of each of those communities over the course of the last year on a couple of different occasions, just to kind of get a feel, get some input. And I think you have a slide or two to talk to some of the meetings we had. But suffice to say that in recent weeks, DEP has reached out to HRG, knowing that we were working on this project. They have asked us, and I'm sure you could touch on it a little bit later on, they have asked us to, if we would consider at least looking at other municipalities within the watershed, within the county that may have some issues that we would not be exclusionary to them, and I assure them that we're not in it to be exclusionary. We're looking to really expand on this. So really just trying to control up there, but we're not necessarily limited to, they were the original 8 that we had engaged for a conversation moving forward.
And just to clarify too, one of the requirements for any regional authority is for those communities to be continuous, correct?
Well, that was the question. I'm not sure we got confirmation on that. You were talking about being contiguous to what, I'm not sure we got confirmation on it. Let's just say that it worked out that way. I'm not sure that's a requirement for it, but we're not sure on that. But
Okay.
in this case, they are.
So we're waiting for clarification on DEP
If they have to
from
be-
DEP.
If they have to be contiguous.
Okay.
So Larry, if I could just add one thing. So initially, the county was 22 municipalities. 17 said they were interested. Now we're proposing 8. What about those other 9?
That's the part I'm getting to, Councilman. It's not that the countywide authority would be governed by a county, theoretically or hypothetically, it could be governed by a countywide authority board if the county would, they would institute the authority and they would appoint their board members and they could go at a county level. This is more of a joint municipal board where each of those municipalities would have representation on the board. So initially, again, to control that narrative and to get buy-in from the communities, we kept it to a manageable number. But it doesn't mean that other municipalities are excluded from it. They can, at some point, if they wanted to be part of the authority, they can. They may not have board representation, or they may. I don't know. That'll be done later by the lawyers and the bylaws. But the point is, this would be an initial group that has common interests that we could form a board and then we could get it stood up and we could get starting to move forward with it. So those other municipalities would still have an opportunity, and that's my point about DEP asking if we could still have some conversation with them, and of course we agreed we would have some additional conversations.
So if all 22 agreed, it would then be a countywide initiative. The Lackawanna County Commissioners would develop a board that wouldn't necessarily have representatives from all 22 municipalities, but just a regional board that would oversee this.
Right, well, if you go back, the county has the Lackawanna River Basin Sewer Authority Board, which I served on that board. I forget if there's 15 or 17 municipalities that sewer authority, that's the sanitary authority that has the filtration plant up in Troop. But that represents multiple municipalities, and there are only 9 members on that board. So the county commissioners appoint those members to that board. So I had envisioned seeing something along those lines. The county, to their credit, they listened, they heard it, for whatever, maybe they don't have the appetite at this point, or maybe they have enough information, but for each municipality, this is how we got to where we're at, the municipalities that come under these permits and these regulations, it's incumbent upon us to manage. It's not, we could sit here all day long and tell the county that they have to do things. We can't make them or force them to do anything, right? So we have to be responsible for our own permitting and our own stormwater. So that's it's kind of how we got to where we're at today. So there's nothing that says we can't ever convert to a countywide system, or if the county commissioners decide tomorrow that they're on board here. But for now, I think the city, and rightly so, should be pursuing some form of an authority that's going to protect us and make sure that we're in compliance with DEP as it relates to our stormwater.
So you're going to start with 8, and then once you get it up and running, possibility exists to expand it to other municipalities that may realize the benefits of joining in.
That's the idea.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's really looking at, if you're going to have a new startup authority, what number is really manageable to be able to get a program pulled together and implemented within a year or two? There could be an opportunity to do it on your own and pull in more municipalities, but at what point does that take longer in order to actually get the programming decided, to get it off the ground? And we have seen other regional initiatives that have expanded on an existing authority, or there was a single entity that kind of had like jurisdiction, right, over all those municipalities. So if you did it on a county basis, if the county were to implement a county authority, then you have kind of one single entity pulling all of those 22 municipalities together. And when there's a lead entity like that, we've seen that you are able to do that for stormwater and pull it together within a couple years' time frame. But when you don't have a lead entity and we're looking at doing a new startup authority, keeping that number to a manageable size for the first couple of years, and then choosing if you're going to allow other municipalities to opt in, I think it could be an easier approach to get the authority off the ground, if that makes sense. So what we did then is over the last 9 months or so, we pulled in those 8 municipalities and basically went back to the drawing board with them to consider their needs. And so as part of those meetings, we met here in City Hall and we actually did live polling because we wanted to make sure that we were hearing the voices of all 8 municipalities. So we actually put polling questions up on the screen. People use their cell phones to answer. And so what you're seeing here is the actual results of some of the live polling questions. So this first question was asking the municipalities to rank different stormwater management subjects and what was most important to them. And what services were they most interested in from a regional collaboration. And so you can see here, those top 2, funding for existing infrastructure and regulatory compliance, and then regional projects to address flooding and levee maintenance. Those were the top 2 things that they said we could most use support with. And then that was followed by support with existing infrastructure maintenance, and then regulatory compliance was at the bottom based upon, you know, those 5 broad categories. Looking at this and through some more dialogue and discussion with them, we combined the survey results into a 2-phase approach, and that's what's envisioned on the slide. So phase 1, that could commence as early as 2023, 2024, and include a new startup authority, provides initial service to 8 municipalities, but again, as we talked about, those boundaries could change over time as additional municipalities request to opt in. And then under phase 1, the authority could charge a stormwater fee and provide funding back to each of the municipalities to perform local infrastructure improvements. The authority could provide funding for regulatory compliance and could also support BMP, that green infrastructure project support and implementation, along with things like street sweeping, catch basin cleaning, you know, levee maintenance, among other things. And then going to phase 2, let me go back one more slide. There we go. Going back to phase 2, then that's could commence, I would say, as early as 2027. That's really when the authority is ready to expand its services. That's when the authority could take on a larger role. It could become that co-permittee with the municipalities that we talked about earlier. We could see the authority complete additional tasks to administer the permits, taking over potentially, say, ownership of the stormwater assets in the municipalities, perform more in-depth operation and maintenance, repair, replacement of assets. It's where we would anticipate seeing the authority start to look at implementing regional flood control projects. And then also potentially improvements to the levee system as well if the authority were to take over that infrastructure. And so as we kind of talked through the opportunity with the municipalities, one thing that we thought would be important was to understand, you know, we talk about coming together for regional collaboration, it saves money. Well, how much savings would the 8 municipalities really want to see in order to give up that local control over stormwater management? And so here's the results of another live survey that we took with them. So most of the group was split between wanting to see a 20 to 30% savings. We had 2 municipalities hoping for 40 to 50% savings, and we had one that was looking for about, 10%. And so from there, we completed a new business plan. analysis. And so we looked at the services that were provided on that last slide, and if we said if we did it now with only 8 municipalities, what would it cost to pull that off? And how much of a savings would that be compared to municipalities doing it on their own? And so here's what we found, that's on the slide. So we compared cost over a 20-year perspective period of time. So the numbers that you see on this slide, these are 20-year present worth costs. So Scranton is actually shown up here as city number 1. We determined that the city would save roughly 20% in managing stormwater together as through a regional authority as compared to the city managing stormwater alone. So if you look at city separate, that's what we are projecting if the city were to continue to manage stormwater costs on their own. And then what you see as the city regional, those are the anticipated costs if you come together as a regional entity. So we have estimated capital cost, we have annual operation and maintenance cost, and then we're looking at the present worth cost. And so we did that for one of the other boroughs and one of the other townships that are part of those 8 municipalities. And for those, we saw savings between 39% and 49%. And so we believe those numbers to be indicative then of the other 5 municipalities. And so based upon this information, we see this incentivizing participation of those 8 municipalities.
Is this the same slide that was presented the last time?
No,
we
it
came?
wasn't. So when we did this last time, it was part of the feasibility study looking at 22 municipalities. So there we looked at if the county were to implement a county authority, how would those services be performed? So back then, we were performing those services, in many cases, with that county authority contracting back with a county to do a lot of that work. Here, we had to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, well, if it's only 8 municipalities, how would we still perform those services? And so, we even talked to those 8 municipalities and we said, hey, if we were gonna do street sweeping, regional, who has a street sweeper crew and equipment they're not using 5 days a week, but they'd be willing to do it as part of this regional collaborative if you got money back in order to do that. So we had to go back to the drawing board in terms of how these services were being provided. So the table looks similar, but you're gonna see the numbers are a little different.
That's what I was going to say. So
Yeah.
do these numbers stay consistent with that table? Have they gotten better? Have they gotten worse?
So the city's number is pretty close. I wanna say we were looking at 23, 24%. So it's pretty close. Now, the savings for the other municipalities, they came down.
Okay.
And, part of that I mentioned earlier, that there's a lot of fixed costs for stormwater management. So when we were taking those costs and splitting them up over 22 municipalities, it was cheaper. Now, labor, for instance, right? If you're gonna have an executive director of this authority, they're gonna do it for a countywide basis, you're splitting that cost over 22 municipalities. Here, we'd be splitting it over 8. So there's definitely less municipalities that we're spreading the costs around, but we're still seeing savings that we think are going to incentivize participation. And that was one of the important aspects for going back and doing this mini plan, going back and doing the business plan, was to see how close our numbers were as compared to the county-based approach. Another question we asked the municipalities is, what's their preference in enacting a regional stormwater fee to fund this, as opposed to having a cost share approach, where each municipality would have cost allocated to them, and then they would pay into the cost share, and they could figure out how they wanted to come up with that money. Did they want to do it through tax revenue, or did they want to enact a stormwater fee of their own? And the municipalities unanimously felt that they preferred a regional fee as opposed to another way of funding the program. And this slide displays the benefit of that decision. So for those same 3 municipalities that we previously considered, we compared if the municipality funds stormwater through tax revenue versus if a property owner pays for a stormwater fee, and we assumed that stormwater fee would range between $5 and $8 a month. I think we used $78 a month here. And so we found that residential property owners in these three municipalities would save between what we're estimating 56 and 93% to pay for a stormwater fee in place of funding through taxes. And so some of the reasons why you see that savings is with the stormwater fee, all developed properties are going to pay a fee based upon their impervious area. So tax exempt properties would pay towards stormwater. It's a stormwater fee. And then we also see that assessed property value is not necessarily indicative of the amount of impervious area on a property that's generating stormwater runoff. So when we allocate those costs based upon impervious area and not based upon assessed property value, that's another reason why we start seeing a savings. And so the business plan model looked at the proposed list of services, determined how they would likely be provided and what the cost of that would be. And we looked at how that might impact a residential homeowner if they were to be charged a stormwater fee. So this slide shows a potential fee range. So for phase one, we're estimating an average residential fee between $5 to $8 per month. And that depends on if the municipality has levee infrastructure, which would be maintained for the program, and if the municipality chooses to get money back each month for infrastructure maintenance. So you can see, like on line 2 here, monthly infrastructure fee to municipality. So we assumed that we'd tack on $1 per equivalent residential unit that would go back to the municipalities that they could use to maintain their own stormwater infrastructure on their own. So depending upon, if that's tacked on there, we're looking at, phase one fees between, say, $5 and $8 a month for the average residential property owner. Now, with the stormwater authorities that we're seeing implement fees across the state, I would say that the ones that are implementing fees now, or the ones that have been implementing fees for the last couple of years, on average, they've been charging about $10 per month for the average residential property owner. And even in the last year or two, we've been seeing those inch up, I would say more towards $12 a month. So let's say 10 to 12 is what we're starting to see as the average for a single municipality implementing a stormwater fee to fund their program. So when we're showing cost of $5 to $8 a month, I think we can see right there some of those savings that's being naturally derived from regionally working together on stormwater. So when we met with the municipalities, now this was about 9 months ago. This was before we went back and were able to calculate the cost savings for this 8-member authority. So when we asked them then, okay, based upon this whole discussion, hey, we're not, it looks like that county authorities would be tabled for a couple of years. Would you be interested in moving forward together? They said back then, 96% responded that they believed their municipality would opt into a regional collaboration. We had 4% that said that they were unsure. That was before, again, we had this new business plan information on the savings that we're going to be providing now to the municipalities over the next month or two. So, with that, kind of where we're at right now, October, November this year, providing those results back to the municipalities. The next step would be to provide a memorandum of understanding to the municipalities, then basically saying, are you interested? Are you willing to commit to your interest in saying you'd like to work together in an effort to hit on like some of the main goals of the program, of the collaboration? And with them then kind of more formally saying, yes, we're interested, then it could make sense to start moving forward with some of the next stages. So that would include things like getting we're working with the city solicitor, potentially outside legal counsel, to, draft up, say, an intergovernmental cooperation agreement. It could look at going out and starting to develop the impervious area that would be, necessary in order to go back and look at both DEP regulation, what you need to do for stormwater management, and then also start looking at how revenue for the program would be divided. There'd also be some additional discussions that should be had with DEP on permit compliance, and basically how these municipalities come together and start working together on these green infrastructure projects in order to see cost savings, and working together as opposed to what they're doing right now, which is trying to start implementing projects on their own. And then going into, spring of 2023, it would be looking at actually coming under those intergovernmental cooperation agreements, looking at potentially adopting articles of incorporation bylaws for a new authority, and then starting to work together with work group meetings between the municipalities in order to start firming up the programming and what would fully be provided through this new authority. Is there anything that you wanted to kind of add relative to those next steps?
The only thing I'll point out here is, we talk all the time, there's never any shortage of work here in the city, but as you can see, the work that's been put into this, this whole process for organizing or standing up an authority is no small matter. There's still a ton of work that needs to be done just to get us up for 23 or 24. So the only thing I'll say is that, there are a few bullet points up there, but I could rest assured there are several more things that have to happen in between just to make sure that we are staying on track with that time. So we really appreciate HRG's leadership on this. They've done it down in Luzerne County and other places throughout the state, so we appreciate their experience helping us out. So is there another slide that you have to go through, or is that it now? So I don't have anything further if you want to give a...
I have a quick question. So, you were here a year ago, and you've made some progress, and you're always very informative. So, with that said, you made mention earlier that you're doing similar projects like this throughout the state. So, where are we in comparison with targeted compliance with other parts of the state going through the same process? Are we in the same stage, or are they ahead of us? Where are we at in comparison?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that throughout the state, we're seeing, groups of municipalities come together in different ways, and try to figure out how to best comply. As we've spoken to DEP, there's a number of the municipalities that we put up on the screen earlier that are behind in permit compliance. And DEP is saying, yeah, these guys could really use some help, and that's one of the first things that they would be interested in us doing as part of this programming, is trying to get all the municipalities, up to the same level. And that's really what's determining where they're going to start putting these green infrastructure projects. As we look at other municipalities in the Lackawanna Valley, especially the Mid-Valley municipalities, it appears from what DEP is telling us that there's some municipalities up there that are behind in compliance as well.
If I could just add to that, as far as the state goes, I know with the inception of the authority down in Luzerne County, it kind of brought a large portion of Luzerne County up into the stormwater management world. Prior to that, again, in my prior job, when I had met with DEP in Harrisburg regarding stormwater management, the state DEP at the time had split the state up into 6 different sectors. Of course, us being in the Northeast, we were, to their words, we were the worst in compliance in terms of the 6 different districts throughout the state. Northeastern Pennsylvania was the worst in terms of compliance. So I know there's been a lot of work done since then, and I know that we continue to do work, not just from a regional aspect, but from a municipal aspect. So to answer your question, I know there are other parts of the state that have done them they have been more proactive, and they've done a much better job at leading this thing along and heading off some of these issues. But we have made great strides here in the Northeast. Right, do you agree?
Yeah, so I guess to answer your question, in each of the areas where we've been working, as we pull the municipalities together, we see the municipalities at different stages. You know, some that maybe the municipality itself implemented a stormwater fee, they're ahead in their project, you know, deadlines, where the municipality next to them might be really struggling to develop their revenue and move projects forward. So seeing municipalities at different stages, I would say, is the same in each of the collaborations. I would agree with what Larry said in terms of there appear to be more regulatory deficient municipalities in this area. I know we mentioned WVSA earlier in the presentation. I know with that collaboration, there were a number of municipalities that had similar issues, being behind in compliance. I also know, I personally received calls from some township managers after DEP went through this past year and did their annual audits, because they said, I can't believe I passed. I've never passed before. DEP didn't have a single finding or write-up. So we have seen over just a couple of years, municipalities been able to turn around when a regional solution is offered.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, so last time you were in, you talked about, everybody has their own timeline, everybody has their own timeline for their particular individual permit,
For their
right?
permit.
Per municipality. So when we were talking about regionalizing here, I think it may have been stated that if we combine together, maybe some of these municipalities felt that their permits would restart. Is that still correct? Or that they would have more time to come into compliance?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So when we met with DEP over the last month, and we specifically talked to the DEP about the 8 municipalities that we showed, they really fall into 2 groups in terms of compliance. So there's a group whose permit runs from 2018 to 2023 when they need to have projects done, and there's about 4 that fall into that group. And then there's another group whose timelines are really similar to the city of Scranton. And so your timeline would be 2022 through 2026, 2027. So as we talked to DEP, they kind of said, those other municipalities who have a timeline more similar to Scranton, we can see everyone coming together to look at implementing BMPs, but we'd want to make sure those other municipalities, those ones who really need to have them done by next year, we want to know that they have 50-60% of their green infrastructure projects at least started. Like we need to be able to tell EPA before we start giving more timeline, more time for everyone to be compliant. We want to at least be able to tell EPA, hey, they did take strides, and because of that, we can reframe it to look at the timeline for a regional initiative.
I think, I'm not sure where you're going with the question, but those municipalities that Adrian referenced that would expire before, our permit, it's not like they're going to get a free pass. They would still be held to some compliance. They would need to do some of those projects before before their permit expires. So, but once if the authority was successful, they stood it up, I think we envision that at some point, all those municipalities would be under that same permit, under the authority, and then they would be moving forward all under the same permitting cycle.
So it would help them to get a little bit more time to get their own area under compliance?
Well, that's to Adrian's point. They're currently under permit. They are already required to do some best practice changes. Coming from the Mid-Valley myself, I know that they struggle no different than we do trying to fund these infrastructure projects. They're very expensive, they're costly, there's a lot of engineering and work that needs to be done with them. So I know they struggle to get them done. That being said, if their permit expires in 2023, they're already under permit to make some of these changes. If we're able to bring them in under a new permit cycle, DEP is not going to say, listen, you didn't finish 100% of it, but if you get a portion of it done, they'll allow you to come into the new permit cycle, but no one's getting a free pass out of it. They would have to they would do some compliance. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think so. And it also seemed like DEP was saying, hey, we're interested in seeing this authority come together, start working on some aspects of permit compliance. And then because each municipality has, findings here or there, and they said, work together to address those findings, get on the same compliance baseline, and then we'll look at moving you into, potentially a joint permit. And I took that to mean we'd probably be looking at another year or two, which is why I kind of had that as phase 2, looking at a joint permit. But we're still able, so you don't need a joint permit to work together on regional BMPs. What you need is an intergovernmental cooperation agreement. And DEP says if you have that in place, you have a regional pollution reduction plan in place, which means DEP approves where we'd put those green infrastructure projects where everyone can claim benefit, then we can move together. So that would be the first phase, is that cooperation agreement.
How is Scranton making out with our compliance deadlines?
So you received your revised permit in, was it June, July? Yeah, 2022. So based upon that, you now have 5 years in order to implement your green infrastructure projects.
I think a point we need to make out is that over the last several years, the city has actually done a pretty fair job of keeping into some compliance. We're not one of those municipalities that are getting the nasty grant from DEP, and we are under new permits. So that being said, we have 5 years to implement our best practices now. So we are not under any duress from DEP. So, okay.
What would be considered a good rating, when it comes to compliance? 40%, 50%, 60%, 90%?
Of our compliance?
Yeah, correct.
I'm not so sure I could give that gauge on it. It's just a brand-new permit, so, we'll have some things that we're going to have to do to come into compliance, like every other municipality, but we have the 5 years to comply. But that's going to take planning and identifying, and as, the city brought HRG on to do the design over on East Mountain, so a lot of those things that managing our stormwater, just trying to keep up with the aging infrastructure, some of those things will help us, but there are bigger things that we needed to come to be in compliance. And that's why, to Adrian's point, as we move forward, we may be able to get through based on the guidance for this permit cycle, but moving forward, we're just not going to have the bandwidth or the capacity here to do. We need to rely on other municipalities to make sure we get the credits that they could provide those best practices that we could get credit for, because we just don't have it here. So that's why it's important for us to move on this in some fashion.
Yeah, and then in addition to having that 5-year window to complete projects, you also are required to submit a report into DEP each September, updating them. It's basically your annual report. And so as part of that, you're talking about what you did over the past year relative to permit compliance. And then from time to time, DEP and sometimes even EPA will come in and then do a full audit. And so I would say, to answer your question, is you'd be looking for no audit findings from DEP when they come in. That would be the gold star relative to meeting your permit requirements. I don't know when the last time, Scranton was. But each year they select different municipalities to go in and do that audit review of.
And in fairness, DEP has been, I don't want to speak for them, but they have been a bit lax the last couple of years due to COVID, but now they're coming back in full swing and making sure that municipalities are in compliance. So again, another reason why I think this is very timely for us to have these conversations, that these municipalities, Adrian mentioned that there are several that are going to be notified, but if they haven't been notified by now, by DEP, that they are not compliant and need to work on some things, so.
Does anyone else have any questions?
So, might be slightly off task, but recently we saw that the landfill is applying for their permit for leachate. How does that fall into our DEP and our EPA?
I'm not exactly sure how that touches on I'm not sure it would even touch our permit, per se.
I mean, they're looking for their permit to, put leachate into our water. Does that come
Yeah,
into
so-
any of this here that we're talking about today? Does it
So
affect
that would be
anything?
covered by a different DEP permit from a different division inside of DEP. And so my understanding is that they act pretty independent of one another. So what they're applying for the leachate discharge for the landfill would not be tied into the MS4 permit program as it currently operates.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions? Just in closing, I know this has been a topic of conversation, during my 5 years on council and even before that. There were some points when I didn't think we'd even get to this stage, so I do commend you for getting us to this stage. Now we just have to, cross the goal line, for a lack of a better term, to really get a regional initiative going, because like you demonstrated here, that will, cut the overall costs, not only for us, but for anyone involved in the initiative.
Yeah. Thank you, and you're right, and I think that, the ARPA funding and some of the dollars that we have from the federal side could really help us as we're navigating. Again, I think the timing is right for us to engage here, so I think if we use those dollars wisely and we invest them where we need to, we could not only come to compliance, but we could come armed with a good authority that could last us for several generations here and manage our stormwater, so thank you for that.
Thank you. So that will conclude our public caucus for tonight. Thank you for coming in. We're going to take just a minute real quick before we start our regular council meeting.